People in society today has taught you that Christians are intolerant and we're bigoted and we're hateful and we're racist, and just keep the name calling coming, right? So if you meet somebody that you do not know and they are not a Christian, a lot of times they already have this mentality. Talked about this a little bit. So what you need to show them is that, you know what? The news is wrong about us. Now there are people that call themselves Christians, right? And they're probably Christians in the same way that I'm a pitcher for the Yankees, just in name only, right? But they call themselves Christians, and when they do that, and then they behave that way, they give us all kind of a bad name, right? So we just have to make sure that when we meet these people, we're always showing Christ's love to them. We're just always showing Christ's love to them. They need to find out what a real Christian, if you will, I hate to use the real Christian thing, but they need to see what a Christian really is, okay? Because a strong majority of us Christians are not what's portrayed in today's society. So just be their friend and work with them. So always interesting, good stuff to know. Keep learning from this as we kind of progress forward. So we talked about empirical evidence, we talked about historical evidence, we talked about which one we do and don't have a problem with. We went on to talk a little bit about DNA. Remember that? Is DNA a language?
Yes.
Can you tell me how many letters are in the language of DNA? Well, I didn't ask you guys. I'm trying to be the smart one. Mr. Wyoming Cowboys.
4.
4, thank you. What? Just the kid with the Wyoming Cowboys pullover on, okay? Can you tell me what the 4 letters are in DNA language?
T, C, A,
You're close.
G.
There's always somebody that can't stand it. So A, C, T, and G, those are the 4 letters. They actually represent nucleotides, but we just call the 4 letters because it's easier that way. And this makes up the whole language of DNA, right? Now, we talked about 2 different kinds of information. What were they?
Simplified and...
Complicated.
Shannon information.
Okay, Shannon information is one of them, and specified information was the other, right? Okay, very good. So, you. Yes. Are you ready? Give me an example of Shannon information. 4 or 5 letters. Oh, dude, what are you doing? I thought you were coming here and listening and stuff. 4 or 5 letters. How about you? Can you do it? Shannon information. Okay.
Don't believe it.
Very good. Excellent. Yeah, very good. Okay, so raise your hand if you knew the answer to that question.
I knew it when I looked at my papers.
Raise your hand again high if you knew the answer to that question. Perry, give me another example of Shannon information. 4 or 5 letters, whatever.
XQRZJ.
Very good. Very good. Okay, excellent. So tell me what Shannon information is. Do you remember?
No.
Okay. Does anybody remember what Shannon information is in their own words? Not you. You're too smart. Shannon information. You can do it right here. Just random letters, right? There's no meaning. There's no context to Shannon information, right? Just 5 random A, B, C, D, E, right? That doesn't make a word. It's just, but it is. It's information. It's English letters, right? But it has no context. It has no meaning. So specified information is information that does have meaning, right? It does have context. So the words I'm saying are specified information. Okay, spelling test, specified information type stuff. So in the DNA, we had specified and we had Shannon information. DNA is made up of which one of those? Specified information, that's right, because it has context and it has meaning, right? And do you remember, I forgot to kind of tell you about this last week, but do you remember when I had that chart up there and I was like, TGG gives you this, and TAG gives you this? One of them, I don't know if you guys remember, but I said one of them was okay. So, quiz questions first. So, A, C, T, and G are nucleotides, right? If you put 3 nucleotides together for bonus points, do you remember what you get when you put 3 of them together?
Codon.
A codon!
Notes.
Gold star for that woman right there. That was awesome. So if you put 3 of them together, you get something called a stop codon. Now, I don't know if you guys remember me mentioning this last week, but you get something called a stop codon. Well, that would premise the idea that there must be a start codon, right? And so what that means is, oh, this is so cool. So we talked about specified information in DNA, right? Now let me tell you that within DNA, not only is it specified information, but you have start codons and you have stop codons. And do you know what they do? They tell the machinery when to start reading something and when to stop reading something. So there's instructions in between the start and the stop codon that tell it what it's supposed to be doing. Similar to what we see in books, like a paragraph. You have the start of the paragraph, and the paragraph is all about, let's say, how to make chicken noodle soup. And at the end of the paragraph, you end the paragraph with a period, and then a new paragraph begins type thing. Okay, that's how your DNA works. There's a start codon that tells it, start reading here for this particular instruction and stop reading here.
Is the codon running along the strand? Like
It's all part. It's all part.
Like every 3 things?
Yes. So you have 3 and 3 and 3 and 3 and 3 and 3 and then so as it's reading the codons, right? As it's reading the nucleotides, which are grouped into codons, eventually you get a start codon and it tells it start reading here.
So since they're paired, is it reading the pairs or is it
Paired.
reading the, like the A to the T?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Is it
Okay,
reading
you're talking about the strands.
Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't go into this either, but since this is a new week, I'll tell you this. So, oh man, this is so cool. So in DNA, you have 2 strands, right? We talked about like railroad tracks. Okay, well the way it's read isn't read this direction. Only like the top line is read this way, the bottom line is read this way. So they're running in reverse of one another and reading one another a different direction. And sometimes what's up here, they're starting to kind of do some more research on this, and they're kind of finding that what's up here is kind of like an English language, but down here is like Spanish. It's like a completely different. It's so deep, it's so crazy what they're finding out about the DNA right now.
Something only God could understand.
Something only God could understand. Yes.
To that end, people either have the idea that there is a God or there is a Big Bang theory that started it. Is it correct?
Well, there would be 2 options. So yes, you're on it. I'll rephrase. So either there is a God behind it all or there's nature behind it all.
Right. So, therefore, if you're talking to people with your learned knowledge, how in the world do they even get past that when you can simply show them all of this order, complicated order in a DNA strand, let alone in a single bug or the workings of a human, or if you want to get even more complicated, try and explain a thought or love or hate, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
How in the world do they even begin to try and tell you it was all created by a Big Bang, random?
So, yeah, so this is, okay, so I'll just, a little bit of a rabbit trail, but let's take it, because I want to tell you guys about when you're engaging with people. This is important for you to know. If you ever do engage with people, there is something you're going to find here. And that is that you're going to meet people, and I always say this, Frank Turek puts it a different way, but it's the same concept. You're going to find seekers, and you're going to find scoffers. Those are about the only 2 you're ever going to run into. Seekers and scoffers. And the seekers they genuinely want to know. And they're ignorant. And when I say ignorant, I don't mean mean, like you're stupid, right? I mean, they're ignorant. They just don't know enough about it. They've never heard the information before. But they want to know. Like they're willing to learn, right? I can work with ignorance. All day long I can work with ignorance. I can give you information if that's what you're asking for. What happens is, though, you'll meet a lot of scoffers. And all they want to do is keep trying to pin you in a corner and pin you in a corner. So they ask question after question, and you answer their question. And it's a different question on a different topic, and then you answer it. And it's a different question on a different topic. As soon as they're about 3 or 4 questions in, I know, listen, we're not going anywhere here. They're scoffers. And it doesn't matter what I say, and it doesn't matter what information I give them. They do not care. They don't care.
No
It's
depth.
it's always going to be nature.
No depth of
Nope.
support.
They don't care. And usually what happens is you have 2 kinds, seekers and scoffers, and there's 2 problems with people. You usually have a head problem or you have a heart problem. If you have a head problem, I can deal with you, okay? Because you're just looking for knowledge. You're open-minded. You want to know more. If you have a head problem, great, let's talk. Let's do coffee. But if you have a heart problem, there ain't any amount of head information I can give you that will cure that heart problem. And those people usually have something like, my mom died at a young age, and I hate God. Something happened to me when I was a child. I was abused as a child, and I hate God. My divorce was really messy, and my kids hate me, and now I hate God. And that's almost always where that goes. And this is very, very, very strong within the atheist community. I see this all the time. And they'll deny it till their dying day. I don't have a problem with God. I don't have a problem with God. But the truth is, you give them all this information and they just deny it because that veil is over their eyes. And until that veil has been lifted, which we cannot do, only the Holy Spirit can do, until that veil has been lifted, there's nothing you can do with that person. You can just love on them. You can be their friend. Maybe they open up at some time down the road. But I can give them all the cerebral information they want because they'll all come off as free thinkers and open-minded, and we're the brights, we're really smart, and you creationists are not, and so on and so. You'll get all this kind of stuff from them, but you'll start giving them this information, and they don't want anything to do with it because they don't want God. Maybe they have a problem with authority. They hate authority. Well, who's the ultimate authority? They don't like God. He's the ultimate authority. A lot of them have had tons of problems with their father growing up. They hate their father. So if they hate their earthly father, they're not going to want a heavenly father. It's a father, right? It's that concept. It's that mindset. They don't want him either. And so no matter what you tell them, no matter how many conversations you have, they will never get it because they don't want to. They don't want to. It'll always be nature. It's always nature. What about life from non-life? Nature. What about the Big Bang? Nature. What about the complexity of DNA? Let me show you specified information. Nature. They'll never, ever look on the face of God because they don't want it. So, to answer your questions, how do they not see it? God has not revealed that to them. He hasn't lifted that veil for them. They're not open to that.
They just choose not.
They literally, via their own free will, choose not to look at that.
So look for the searchers.
Look for the seekers. Seekers and scoffers. Look for the seekers. Spend your time on the seekers. Now, the scoffers are scoffers. That doesn't mean they're always going to be scoffers. But until you can make a breakthrough with a scoffer, you're wasting your time. You're going to spend hours and hours of your life talking to someone who does not care. They don't care, right? Maybe a time will come down the road, but it's not now. Maybe it is someone else. So always keep that in mind. Yes?
What confuses me is you go back to the beginning, you say a lot of people's God is nature.
Yeah.
Well, there had to be intelligent design in nature. There had to be intelligent design in the Big Bang Theory. Where did they go with the beginning of it all?
Oh! And that takes us to what will be the second part of tonight's talk.
Okay.
So thank you. You're on page 5, you're on page 15, I'm on page 1. I don't know if we'll make it there tonight, but we will. That's in my talk. But you're absolutely spot on about that. So, seekers and scoffers, head problems and heart problems. Find the seekers that may just have a head problem. The scoffers with the heart problem, just not your time, just not right now. Talk about the weather, talk about their family, right? Talk about anything else. Insert a little bit, come to church, kind of, a little bit here or there, put that stone in their shoe, but don't spend a ton of time because they're just not ready. They haven't been brought yet. So, okay. All right, so we're going to continue on a little bit more. God, I had examples. I'm so angry. I forgot my. Okay, anyway. So we're going to keep going a little bit more on the creation evolution thing. I want you guys to see this because this is really pretty cool. So we have the fossil record. You guys, we talked a little bit about the fossil record, right? And this is one of the most referenced evidences for evolution. So at the time of Darwin, he thought the fossil record went from less complex to more complex. We saw single-celled organisms in the very, very, very bottom rocks. And at the top, we have humans. So we went from not so complex to very, very, very complex. But let's go back to Darwin's day. At that time, they didn't know what we know today. The single smallest unit was a blood cell. But for them, a blood cell was kind of like a drop of plasma or like jelly, like a blob of jelly. That was all it was to them back then. They didn't know what we know about the inner workings of the cell. So if we take his perspective on it, it did look like things went from less complex to more complex. However, we know the inner workings of the cell now, and we're like, it's super complex, right? So now we're having a really difficult time defining complex because it's all complex, right? It's all very complex. So in his time, though, he thought the fossil record showed evolution very, very nicely. It's exactly what evolution would have predicted, and that is simple things becoming more complex type things over time as it spread out. And here's an example of the fossil record. Down here you have what are called the Pre-Cambrian rocks. Right above them are the Cambrian rocks, which we'll get into a little bit more here in a little bit. So I want you to remember Cambrian and Pre-Cambrian. This is the lowest most rock layers that we have. Okay, there's nothing below the Pre-Cambrian. So Pre-Cambrian rock layers, Cambrian rock layers, and the rest of it. We won't go into those. But you can see that we start out with some simple organisms down here, which I'm going to show you in a bigger light. And then you start to move up, and eventually you get into fish, you get into land animals, and dinosaurs, mammals, and then of course humans. We get to the top here, and obviously we went through a period where we had fish to amphibians, amphibians to reptiles, reptiles into mammals, but we have a problem. There's mammals in the ocean, right? You got to get mammals back into the ocean, and that's where the dog and or cow and or hippopotamus turned into a whale. That's where they get that idea, right? So it was kind of ironic how God set it up, because they have this all laid out, and they get to the top, and mammals are supposed to come into existence up here, but you have mammals in the ocean, so now you've got to get a mammal that came to exist on land back into the ocean somehow, and that's where this whole idea behind like a dog into a whale came from. You got to get a mammal back in. So anyway, this is how it all progresses, okay? So back in Darwin's day, they had some fossils, enough fossils he thought he could kind of make the picture grow, kind of put it together, and he thought for sure that as they start to dig up more fossils, all of this would fill in. Oops. All of this would fill in, right? Of course, now we're years down the road, and it has not filled in. But one of his big ideas was dealing with something called transitional organisms. You guys seen the shirt where the monkey turns into a human? Yeah. Right? So you have the monkey and they have the human. And then all the things in between, those are transitional. They're all transitioning from one into something else. Does that make sense? Okay? And that would make sense. Let's pretend for a second, put on your evolutionary hat, let's pretend evolution is true. If you're going to get from a fish to a land animal, the fish is going to have to go through a series of minor changes before it finally gets to an amphibian. And then some more changes before it gets to some sort of what they call a tetrapod, which is a four-legged creature, and then eventually into the rest of things. But there has to be small steps along the way, right? Fish don't give birth to amphibians, and amphibians don't just automatically give birth to like four-legged animals. That's just not how evolution works. That's not what it predicts. Everything is based on predictions, and there are certain predictions that are made by scientific theories such as evolution. So evolution would predict that not only would we see these changes to organisms, but we would see it slow and gradual, right? That's what Darwin said we'd find. as we started digging up more fossils, he says, it's kind of sporadic right now, we don't have a lot, but we're going to fill in all these little gaps the more of these fossils that we find, correct? So he said that we would find a lot of these transitional organisms. So I'm going to give you probably one of the most popular transitional series of organisms, and this is one I talk about a lot. So in addition to the whole ape to man thing, here's one that is very, very popular in a lot of the books. You'll see this all the time. And that is a fish into a land animal, right? And here's the transition. You have a fish, and now you have something where you can kind of start to see that those front fins are becoming maybe a little bit more stout. Eventually those front fins turn into something that are kind of like legs, but the backs haven't really come in. They're still kind of fins, right? This would be similar to like a mud skipper. This is your amphibian, right? So you have the fish that slowly changes in very, very small increments into what would be an amphibian. The amphibian then eventually starts hanging out on land more often. It adapts to its environment of being on land a lot. And so now these four legs here, or four appendages, we'll call them, eventually turn into four actual legs, and you get something called a tetrapod up here, which is a four-legged creature, like a dog is a tetrapod or a cat is a tetrapod. It's just a four-legged creature. So this is the most popular. In addition, you're going to notice that the skull starts to change and the nose holes start to change. So instead of being the nose, the nostrils, towards the front of the skull, they have evolved to now be more towards the top of the skull because it's on land now, and they become bigger because they're breathing oxygen now. Okay? So in a classroom, this is how this would be presented, and this would be a case for evolution. Now, there was a guy named Neil Shubin. He is at the University of Chicago, and what we had in this transitional series was this one, this one, this one, and this one. And this PhD from Chicago said, you know what? There's got to be this thing somewhere. It's got to exist somewhere. And it should be in rocks that are right around, and I think he called it like 170 million years old or something. But he said we should find them in these age rocks, and it should be this kind of an organism. And so he went digging. And on one of his last days of looking, he found this thing, and he called it Tiktaalik. And this was heralded as like the knockdown, drag out creation is done. We have shown evolution. It was all of the predictions that would have been made. In the prediction of evolution, he would have expected to find an organism that looked a little bit more evolved than this one, and just a little less evolved than this one. Does that make sense? And he would have expected to find it in rock layers that were above this guy, but below this guy. Does that make sense? And lo and behold, he did. This is exactly what he found in the right rock layers and the right organism. This thing was huge when it came out. This was a big slap in the face of the. Matter of fact, they took shots, pot shots, in the scientific magazines at creationists for not believing in evolution, because now the series had been completed. All predictions had been made. Not only did we find the right organism, we found it in the right rock layers. And so it was, in my opinion, at the time, couple decades ago, I'm like, that's actually really good. Like, that's exactly what you would expect, all right? So, one for the evolutionist, right? I couldn't deny this. If I was going to be open-minded and claim to be open-minded about this stuff, I couldn't be dogmatic and say, no, that's not true. I had to accept it for what it was. And this was really good. So this Tiktaalik creature ended up being like one of the icons of evolution. It was huge when it was found. So, it met the predictions. Now, I said something about science. science not only makes predictions, but in order to be considered science, it also has to be, do you remember the word? Repeatable, testable, observable, which this is not, so we would dispute this as a creationist, right? But it also has to be, I'm going to throw this word out, see if you remember it, falsifiable. Do you guys remember that? You have to be able to falsify this. If you cannot falsify this, then this isn't technically science. So it is falsifiable. And let me tell you what, and I don't know if I even have it in here. I don't. Took it out. So what they found, though, later on, after this Tiktaalik was just big news for quite a while, right? A guy went digging for just any fossils he might find, and he came across something called tetrapod tracks. So he came across an organism that actually looked like this. This is called an ichthyostega, but like a reptile is like something like this, right? Low to the ground, and they kind of walk, and they have a particular gait in the way they walk, right? On their all fours. So, yeah, right, yes. So a gait is just the way something walks. Anyway, they found tetrapod tracks in this limestone. And he's looking at it, and there's a ton of them. And this thing was huge. It was like 7 feet long, whatever it was. So it was like this ichthyostega thing, but like 7 foot long ichthyostega, right? It's a big monster. And they could tell because of the way it walked. They could see by the footprints, and there were tons of footprints, lots of them. So he looked at it and he said, that's definitely a tetrapod. It's definitely tetrapod tracks. Well, here was the controversy. He found these tetrapod tracks in rock layers that were down here. Right? So he found tetrapod tracks in rock layers down here. Let me try to break this down for you. Why is that a problem? Some of you got it instantly, some of you did not, but let me break down why this is such a problem. Okay? We've been told that kinds, right? We talked about kinds from the Bible, and one kind leads to another kind type thing, right? It's only the same kind, right? Dogs come from dogs, cats come from cats, and blah, blah, blah. That's what we know about the science that we've observed in today's society, right? It's always the same. However, we have a problem now, and that is footprints of this type thing are down here in rock layers of footprints like this type of thing. That is not a prediction of evolution. It would not have predicted to find these types of footprints down here in these kinds of rock layers. You should not have found those. So now it's easier to believe that these organisms lived right alongside these organisms, and this guy was nothing more than a descendant of these guys down here, right? So we had four-legged creatures walking around with these guys down here, all living at the same time, in the same place, doing the same thing. And so it was easier to believe that this guy gave birth to a bunch of things that eventually became this guy, which they're all the same, right? Four-legged creature became a four-legged creature, which is what we would think, right? And it blew this whole thing up.
So you simply look for that same process below the bottom layer.
Oh, perfect.
And it doesn't exist.
Ah, yes, that's exactly right. So you totally nailed it, dude. Okay, so now, the evolutionist now has been presented with tetrapod tracks down here. They see the problem. They know the problem. They recognize the problem. So what was their fix? Their fix was, oh, well, all of these things must exist down here someplace. We just haven't found them yet. Do you see what I mean?
So I've heard you don't find fossils below 16,000 feet. Have you heard
Could
that?
be. I've never heard that, but could be.
It was to do with oil exploration. The guy says, well, we have huge pools of oil below 16,000 feet. So he's saying oil is a natural mineral. It's not decomposed. Dinosaurs and plants.
Okay.
That's what he's saying.
Okay.
And he's saying you find that because, for whatever reason, he says in these cores you don't find any fossils below 16,000 feet.
Okay. All right. I don't anything about that,
Has
so I
that
can't
been
speak to that.
verified that
So-
it is not?
I don't know.
We'll just take your
Just
word
this
for it.
guy I heard, yeah.
Okay, I have not looked into that, so I can't comment on it. But do you guys now see the problem? Do you see four-legged creatures down here? So it's hard to believe that this evolved into a four-legged creature if they already existed down here. Does that make sense? So now the evolutionist doesn't say, well that's good. We have falsified this whole idea. I guess we'll go back to the drawing board. No, they go, oh well, if you find four-legged creatures down here, then all of these things must also exist down here because we know that fish evolved into land animals. So we'll just keep looking for those fossils until we find them. That's that whole brain, head problem, heart problem thing. That's a perfect example, right? From a head problem thing, you see it and you go, wow, that's really cool. Now, for this guy to be existing alongside all of these things at the same time, what would that be a prediction of? What other idea would that be a prediction of? Creation, right? Because God created everything all at once, right? That's exactly what creation would predict. Exactly what creation would predict. Of course we're going to find these kind of guys down here in these kind of rock layers. Yes?
So, if they thought this happened millions of years ago or whatever, why wouldn't the fish today start changing like those now?
Well, it could.
We just
But
don't
But
have
we
millions of years yet.
Yeah,
So
but I'm
that's
saying,
it.
you know what I'm
Sure.
saying?
No, sure. So an evolutionist would say that everything around us is still evolving. Everything's still changing. We'll eventually change into something else. Millions of years from now, we won't maybe be what we are, or some of us won't be what we are. They'll still be humans, but then there'll be another group of something else that evolved from the humans. Does that make sense? So even all the fish that we see today, they're still evolving as well. And they'll be something different in a million years from now or something. That's how that idea kind of goes. Does that make sense?
It's not provable.
Well, we can't, right? Because it takes millions of years, and we won't be around in millions of years. So there's no way to disprove them either.
But shouldn't you see something in between?
Well, we do. That's what they'll claim. They'll say, look, we have all these kinds of things
But I
in
mean,
between.
the animals we have now, not just fossils.
Right, we should, and we don't.
That's what I meant.
We don't, and we don't. Yeah, we'll talk just a little bit more about that. Yes, Donna, do you have something else?
Well, to evolve, doesn't it need a stimulation to evolve? It needs like something wrong goes in the environment. So, you know, that's what they would say right now. Maybe the climate change is going to cause more
Yes.
evolution.
Environment changes, the organism changes to meet the environment. That's kind of how the idea is. That's exactly what
But
it
you
is.
see, if there's no change, then there should, according to
Ah,
that kind of evolution.
So this is back to what we talked about before. So do you remember when I say that it has to be falsifiable? Right? And do you remember the example I gave you of the heads I win, tails you lose? Okay, so we're back to that, Donna. You're absolutely right. So this is that monster, right? I'm just going to eat it all. Ugh. I'm the evolution monster. I just eat everything. All evidence that's counter to me, I'll just bring it in anyway. I'll make some excuse and we'll make it all fit. Everything fits evolution. And
Just
this is
gonna
what we talk about.
recycle it.
Yes, right.
Everything
So,
like that.
once again, I'll repeat this again for you guys. If things change over millions of years, it's evolution. Right? Now, if the environment is perfect for that particular organism, and it never changes over millions of years, it's still evolution. It's called stasis, which means no change. So if things change over millions of years, it's evolution. If things don't change over millions of years, it's still evolution. So it's a heads I win, tails you lose proposition. They can't be beat. Evolution cannot be falsified, right? How do I falsify that? I can't falsify it. It's unfalsifiable. If it doesn't change, oh, well, it was perfectly suited for its environment for 500 million years, like the horseshoe crab. Well, what if it did change? Oh, well, that's evolution. That's exactly how evolution works. The environment changed, and it changed along with it. And that's why we're here. Right? So, yeah, so there's really no way to defeat evolution anymore because it's a big monster that just eats everything. No matter what you find, it eats it.
Until you have a need, you don't have evolution. If you have someone who has a tough time finding food, then they evolve. If you have a tough time breathing, then they evolve. If you have a tough time with pollution or something, they will evolve.
Right? That's
Evolution.
yeah, and actually we can see some of that today.
But
There are
that-
fish that experience this clean water, then they get polluted water, and the fish change. They don't
They
die.
adapt.
They adapt. They adapt. But they're still fish.
Yeah.
They're still the same fish.
Yeah.
That type of stuff, which we've talked about before. Yeah, which we've talked about before. Yeah, so anyway, this was one of the heralded examples of evolution. But you can see that, once again, you know, we find tracks here, down here. Now all of a sudden it blows this whole thing up. And now they're back to the drawing board. So this was very interesting. I thought this was a really good example of what we should see in terms of transitions. So the point was to introduce you to what a transition is. And now you kind of see it. We've been over it. So let's do something just a little bit. Let's take this one more step and break down the fossil record a little more. The very lowest rock layers, remember I said are Pre-Cambrian and Cambrian? Do you remember those? We are going to work off of the old Earth time frames, just for ease of simplicity. We're just going to use these. So 541 million years ago to 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, supposedly. So the Pre-Cambrian rocks would include all of this, right? The Cambrian rocks would be 485 million years ago to 541 billion years ago. So I want you to remember the Pre-Cambrian rocks and the Cambrian rocks. I'm going to give you a little fun fact, by the way. So we were talking about like pools of oil and stuff that they're finding. So they've drilled down to the deepest reaches of the ocean floor, and they pull up these cores, and they examine these cores to try to find oil and stuff. Do you know what they do find? The rock layers on the ocean floor are younger than the rock layers on the Earth. Kind of cool, right? So the Pre-Cambrian and Cambrian rock layers that we find all exist in a place where we can go visit them. A lot of them are in China, and there's places all over the world that actually reveal these kinds of rock layers, and this is where we find all kinds of organisms. But the oldest rock layers are actually found up here on the crust, on the upper layers, whereas if you dig down into cores in the ocean floor, those rock layers are younger than the ones up
So
here.
they're pushing the others up.
This will take us into flood geology.
How did they
Yes.
Well, how do they know? Well, number one, what kind of rock is Pre-Cambrian versus Cambrian? What kind
Okay,
of rock
so-
is, and how do they? Are you getting the number of this is older? What kind of dating did they use?
Well, so there's two types of dating you guys need to know about: radiocarbon dating and radiometric dating. Carbon dating and metric dating. Radiocarbon dating, radiometric dating. Remember those two. Radiocarbon dating, we are carbon-based life forms. We as humans are carbon-based life forms. So radiocarbon dating requires something that was once alive to date test it. But because it was alive, eventually it deteriorates to a point where we can no longer detect the carbon. I believe the half-life of carbon is like 5,241 years or something, and that's because I'm stupid and a geek. But anyway, you get to a point where you can no longer detect the carbon in the actual sample that you have. And that's at about 50 to 80,000 years old. So you can't use radiocarbon dating for rock layers that are millions or billions of years old. Does that make sense? Radiocarbon dating, 50 to 80,000 years max. Radiometric dating is what they use for these billions of years and such. We won't get into that right now, but it's fraught with assumptions. Parent isotopes and daughter isotopes and what was there at the beginning and how we know what was there at the beginning. And now we're finding out that, gee, large amounts of water can change the daughter and the parent and all this other type stuff. Like we're finding, gee, where would the large amount of water come from? Gee, I don't know. Sorry. Anyway, yeah, so
basically the entire dating thing that
That's
you're
very
really presenting to
controversial.
us right here is nonsense.
yes, I would say radiocarbon dating. This is tough. So this is tough. Radiometric dating, I would say we could throw that out. There's so many examples where it just conflicts with one another. Like Mount St. Helens, we know how old that igneous rock is, right? And we've done radiometric dating on that. And it comes back with years of like hundreds of thousands of years to billions of years old, depending on which lab you sent it to and who did the work. Truth is, we know it's only like, what, 50 years old or 40 years old or whatever, because that's when they erupted.
Yeah.
Then they always have a rescue device for that. Well, that's because of, and so on and so forth. Right, so radiometric dating, there's so many discrepancies with that, and so many examples of so many discrepancies that I think we can throw radiometric dating out. Radiocarbon dating, that's a tougher one. That's a tougher one. Because we're caught in a quandary with radiocarbon dating. And that is, radiocarbon dating will come back with stuff that's like 40,000 years old, 50,000 years old. So if you're a young Earth creationist and you're thinking it's only maybe 6 to 10,000 years old, the Earth is, 50,000 years old doesn't fit, right? Doesn't work. However, there are lots of things that they dig up that they radiocarbon date, and it comes back and fits the time of Caesar, or the time of what would be Moses, or the time of this, or the time of that. And so sometimes that you'll find, and I see Christians do this a lot, where they'll be like, that's all bunk, it ain't 50,000 years old. But then they'll take something that fits, like the reign of Solomon, right? They'll be like, well, this was carbon dated, and it fits right with Solomon. So that's right there, see that sign? Carbon dating's awesome. So you can't flip in and out. You live by it and die by it. Radiocarbon dating, yeah, I'm a little bit more sold on that. And it's because of, number one, a lot of it's after, like, post-flood, something changed. From pre-flood to post-flood, something changed. What that was, I'm not sure. But there was so many things that changed after the flood, right? You look at the rock layers prior and the rock layers after and the lifespans of the people in the Bible, all of a sudden everything changes. Something changed in the environment. And so what that affected, what it didn't affect, I don't know. But a lot of the carbon stuff, I think, was all post-flood. So I think we can rely on it, and it seems to match what we find. So when it comes to dating techniques, guys, I would say radiometric dating, which is millions to billions of years, it's not right. There's just something wrong with it. Carbon dating, on the other hand, I think it has its place. Maybe there's still some stuff that needs to be fine-tuned, but I think it has its place. So, anybody else?
Isn't the radiocarbon dating, aren't they assuming the levels of radiation in the air?
Yes.
You don't actually know?
Yes.
You could explain that?
Yes. All dating is based on assumptions. We're back to historical science again, right? We have to assume that what was there at the beginning has been constant over the years. So all dating techniques are based on assumptions. And when you start with a false assumption, you will get a false conclusion. A false conclusion. That's how it works. So if any of those assumptions are off, and I'm talking even minuscule amounts, if those assumptions are off by minuscule amounts and you start running it backwards tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, then the rate of error is larger. It's just exponential, right? So yeah, it's all based on assumptions. Very good. So anybody else? Anything?
Since Satan, Lucifer, is the god of this world, don't we get a lot of misinformation in our textbooks?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Most all of us here have been educated in public schools, and we accept what we read in that science books that we're what? Who are we to say it's false? I mean, who puts it in there?
Yeah, so
the person that put it in there is an agent of Satan.
So this is something that I deal with all the time. And I see this all the time. So I'm just Brian Johnson, right? I'm just some punk guy from Rapid City, South Dakota. I don't have a PhD in any of this stuff, right? And so what you get is the textbooks say this, the college level courses say this, PhD scientists say this. How can Brian possibly be right? Right? And so it's this kind of an issue. Well, right. So it's this kind of mentality that we deal with, right? Like why should we trust Brian Johnson, who doesn't have a PhD degree in this, when all the PhDs, or a lot of PhDs, are saying what the opposite thing of what Brian said, and your textbooks are saying, and your college professors are saying, and the college textbooks are saying it. And this just leads us to a whole different conversation about indoctrination. And, you know, just because I'm not a PhD doesn't mean that what I'm saying is false. That's philosophically, That's philosophically incorrect.
We use the word theory a lot.
Theory.
Theory is guesswork, right?
No, theory is not guesswork. Hypothesis would be guesswork. You guys, have we talked about that? Do you guys remember the different stages? Right? So we have these 3 different stages that we talked about. And do you guys remember what the bottom stage would be? What is that? A hypothesis, right? Someone's like, you know what? I think green grasshoppers will survive better than brown grasshoppers. So then we have to test that, right? And so we test the idea. We test the idea, right? If that test comes back and continuously confirms what our hypothesis was, it gets moved from a hypothesis up to a theory at that point. And then if that theory is tested and tested, it's just so infallible. There's no problems. There's really no issues. Eventually it becomes what?
Proof.
A law. A law. They call it a law. That's why we have the law of gravity. Right? I can drop this 100,000 times and it's always going to fall. Okay? We might not understand every single teeny tiny iota bit of gravity, but we know gravity exists. There's no question about it, right? That is the law of gravity.
But it's no longer a theory.
It's no longer a theory. It's above a theory. Now, evolution is called the theory of evolution, and technically, if they were being fair and open-minded, it would be a hypothesis. They moved that down. So now when Darwin was coming up, I can see where they might have called it the theory of evolution, but now that we've learned so much more, it should be dropped back down to a hypothesis, because now there's just loads of questions. But of course, they'll continue to say, no, theory, pound it home, textbooks, PhDs, Brian's an idiot, these guys are smart.
I think they treat it as a law.
Yeah.
They want to treat it as a law. They just haven't been brave enough to call it that, but you're absolutely
People
right.
act like it is.
Sure, yeah. They're like, oh yeah, it's definite. It's a fact. And you know what? The truth is, they could call evolution a law if they only included empirical science portions.
Right.
You see? That's the man behind the curtain, right? It's the Wizard of Oz. They get you on the whole empirical side. Look at the empirical, look at the empirical, look at the empirical, look at the empirical. Evolution's true. And you're like, yeah, evolution's true. Good. Now let me show you historical.
Yeah.
It's just all part of the same theory. It's all the same thing. No, it's not the same thing. Separated, like this room is separated, okay? Empirical, historical. It's not the same thing. Don't get tricked. Kids, don't get tricked. Yeah, you over here. When you guys are going to school and stuff, do not get tricked on the empirical versus the historical science. That's where they get you.
But all textbooks are written by fallible human beings.
They're all written by infallible human beings.
Yeah.
And this is what we get in our schools. This is why it'd be nice to have, some.
Why won't they come back on you and say, well, the Bible is an example of that?
Example of what?
You just said it's,
Empirical,
They say
historical. You say
doctrine.
historical. Is that what you're saying?
well, you were saying that humans created, so it's infallible, it's fallible.
Fallible. Yes.
So
Oh,
therefore-
that's a whole other topic.
Okay. Okay, but to that end,
Yep.
and throw me out if I'm too far off base.
Cool.
but
You're done.
You have. Anyway, okay, I was thinking, my knowledge, back then in the Bible, during Jesus' time, Moses' time, and that sort of thing, you have Dead Sea Scrolls and written records by people credible writing things down, correct? Would you call it historical?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's historical. So now, but for one example, go back during those times and there's statements made by people that are historical that said people lived 800 and some years. Okay?
Yeah.
How do you explain coming forward to where we live to 120, other than God said we're going to live 120, through the fossil evolution?
Through evolution? I don't think I understand your point.
How would you explain going from 800 years to people living 120 years on down?
Oh,
How did evolution do that?
Well, I would say, I would say,
That's back to your change.
yeah. I would say, I don't know, evolution is not probably the right word. I would just, it's a whole nother
It's
topic.
a reverse thing.
It isn't a reverse thing. I think you would have to go back to, and this is something, remember we talked about DNA error correction, right? You remember that? So, when God created everything, rabbit trail, right? When God created everything, what did he say at the end of every day? It was good, right? He didn't say, oh, so, I could have done better. Right? He said it was good, right? Which means it was perfect. Like, it was perfect, right? So here is an idea for you, and that is Adam and Eve were created, right? 6th day. So, and he created them, and they were good, right? So is it possible that their DNA error correction worked perfectly back then? Sure it is, right? So after the fall, is it possible that the DNA error correction stopped working perfectly after the fall? Okay, so since then, the DNA error correction has been not working correctly. It has been adding to the mutational buildup that we see in us humans. And through that mutational buildup, you also see the lifespan start to drop.
Through God's plan.
Through God's plan.
And what did he say? It is perfect.
It's perfect.
At the beginning.
It's actually not, it wasn't God's plan, but it was a
Way to
result
redeem
of
us.
sin.
Of free will.
God knew it was gonna happen,
Yep.
but he didn't set it all up for it to turn out that way.
Yeah. So you have the situation where, and if you guys go back and plot the actual lifespans of the people starting with Adam and Eve, you'll see that it creates a really nice curve. It's exactly what you would expect, right? Otherwise, it would be like here, then 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 here. It isn't. It actually, if you plot it, creates a beautiful curve. Not perfect, but enough to be almost perfect. So you see the slow, gradual drop in age from Adam and Eve all the way down, with a few exceptions like Methuselah.
Yeah.
Right, of course? So he's like the exception, not the rule.
He's an outlier.
He is. He was like an exception, right? But you see this beautiful graph that just kind of slowly slopes its way down into what we see today.
But then it went up. We living longer now than they did 100 years ago.
No, it's been about the same, actually. So it's just about plateaued. We've about plateaued.
Yeah.
So if you go back and look, now could that be, now hypothetical, little tinfoil hat on my side, but not unfounded, what I'm about to say. Could that be because the DNA error correction was perfect at the time Adam and Eve were created, and has, since the time of the fall, it's been corrupted through sin, and has started to create a mutational buildup in humans? Because we're not evolving into bigger, better, cooler, better creatures. Watch the TV and there's a new drug for some new thing that somebody has somewhere all the time, right? I mean, people are getting worse. You see more cancers, you see more problems, you see more issues, you
We
see
wouldn't
more...
be able to die in order to be redeemed to go to heaven if an error code had stayed perfect.
Yeah, I agree.
Unless it was an accident.
Yeah, I agree. But what I'm talking about is going back to DNA error correction, right? You guys with me? If that was failing over the years, and we know, I've read in the secular peer-reviewed research, and you saw it in the TED video that I gave you, that DNA error correction is responsible for aging. It said at the end of the video, you have the fountain of youth, all you have to do is look inside of you, and most people miss that. And the reason they miss it is because they haven't read the papers. What they're finding out about DNA error correction is that it is the fountain of youth. If we could find a way to make that work more efficiently and not make a mistake once every billion times, we could live longer. It would correct more things. It would fix more errors. It would allow us to live longer.
But how then do you explain your curve from Adam and Eve going like this and now it's like this? Why is it doing this and not continuing down?
Well, it would have to do, so now you have to throw in what changed after the flood, right? So you've got Noah and his wife that were what, 600, 500, 600 years old? And his kids though, they were only like high 2s, then down to mid 2s, then down to kind of high 1s, and now we've kind of plateaued. But they weren't 800 years old after the flood. So now you would have to incorporate not only mutational buildup from DNA error correction that doesn't function as well as it did, and what changed in the environment after the flood. I don't know what that was.
And why is there no discussion of it in the records when it was just a generation or two?
What do you mean by that?
Weren't the sons and then the grandsons and their grandsons looking back and going, gee, Noah was however old, and then his kid only lived till there, and we're living less than that, and what's wrong? Well,
It's in the water.
why?
It's in the water.
Why wasn't that a big concern?
Technically, there was. It was in the water. There was a whole lot of it. Well, I don't know. See, these are all I know, but these are hypotheticals.
Yeah.
You know, why didn't they write down every single word Moses said? Because he was cool. You know, why didn't they? Why we could do this all night long. So I don't know from the speculation
If we
perspective.
saw that in our kids and
We might not think anything of it.
But
They would.
They charted all the ages, but they didn't probably live long enough to look back and, see a big pattern happening probably. But it's all doctored, I mean, it's all
We're looking
documented.
back.
Yeah, we're still talking hypotheticals. So we're still talking hypotheticals.
I think it'd be interesting to look at that curve and see if it's what's the spiral we covered in Sunday school?
The spiral
That's in everything in nature. The Pinelli.
It's really cool.
Oh yeah. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, this circle.
There, shows up in everything.
So, you had a question? Do you have a question back there? No? Yes? Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, a little bit of a rabbit trail, but that takes us, kind of talks about the DNA error correction and the fail and everything. That's completely off where we were. So we'll try to get back on. I will touch on something. This will be kind of another little fun fact for you, because I don't know if I'll get to this in a future talk. But remember we talked about radiocarbon dating, radiometric dating, and we talked about how we use it. So let me give you one example. This is one of my favorite examples to use concerning the Bible. So this will take us a little bit off creation and evolution. We'll then talk about the Bible for just 3 to 5 minutes, which is cool because it's a Bible. So here's the deal. Think about this. Isaiah 53. Right? Who's familiar with Isaiah 53? And it's okay if you're not. Raise your hand. Thank you. Isaiah 53 talks about who?
Jesus.
Talks about Jesus. Talks about his resurrection. Talks about his suffering, his dying. Right? So Isaiah 53, I want you guys to write this down. I want you to go. This is your homework for the week. If you are not familiar with it or haven't read it in a while, this week I want you to read Isaiah 53 and find whatever version works for you, something that's easy for you to understand, easy to read. But that's your homework. Okay? That goes for you too, kid. Isaiah 53. You writing that
You have to
down?
read it too. He's
Isaiah
looking
53.
for it.
Okay, Isaiah 53. Make sure you read it.
Will there be a test next week?
Yes, parents.
Read all of Isaiah whenever you get a chance. It's the best read there could possibly be.
Isaiah's pretty
All
cool.
of Isaiah, starting with the first verse.
He's pretty cool. So I'm going to only ask you to read Isaiah 53, just that one chapter, okay? And what you're going to find, it's going to be very hard to get away from. This is very, very difficult to get away from this. But you're going to find that is definitely about Jesus. And it's going to give you a lot of very detailed information about Jesus and his death.
It's all through Isaiah.
It's just thick through Isaiah. Isaiah 53 is a really good example, though, okay? So read Isaiah 53. See if you don't pull that from it. It'll be about Jesus and his death. And here's the cool thing about that. So, and you sparked my interest because you said the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? So when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found every book of the Old Testament, except for one, it was like Esther or something. Anyway, we found every book of the Old Testament, and one of them that we found was called the Isaiah Scroll. And it's basically the entire book of Isaiah on a scroll called the Isaiah Scroll, right? Now they have carbon dated the Isaiah Scroll 4 different times, 4 different years, in 4 different places. And every time they have, the carbon dates have come back somewhere between that 150 and 800 BC. So if we give every advantage to the non-believer, every advantage, we know, based on carbon dating, that has been empirically tested 4 times from this Isaiah scroll, that the words written in Isaiah were penned at least 150 years prior to Jesus arriving. Now, if you're not familiar with Isaiah 53, when you read Isaiah 53, let me just give you a little deeper perspective into what you are reading. Not only is that the Old Testament, which is prior to Jesus coming, but it's been dated to at least 150 to 800 BC via the Isaiah scroll. This is empirical, scientific, confirmed, observable, testable evidence of something from the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, more importantly the Isaiah scroll, showing that the words were penned at least 150 or more years prior to them being written. Now, when you read Isaiah 53, I want you to pay very close attention to the details that are given within that particular chapter. It will blow your mind at the amount of detail that is given. And it will tell you and prove to you why Isaiah was a prophet and why he was the prophet he was. It's so important that you guys understand this as Christians, because this really opened my eyes to a lot of things, okay? But when you read Isaiah 53, pay attention to details, because prophecy is what giant red ball will fall from the sky, right? And I can say that, and eventually maybe a meteorite enters the atmosphere, and I go, ha! I'm a prophet, right? But big deal, right? I predicted some big red ball would fall from the sky. That's not a big deal. But what if I gave you more details about that? What if I said on July 25th at 2:25 in the afternoon, there will be not 1, but 2 red balls that will fall from the sky. The first one will burn up, and the second one will hit Mount Rushmore and crush all 4 faces. Now, if that happened,
You'd be a prophet.
You're a prophet.
Would I not be a prophet? Right? Because there's so many details to what I just gave you that the chances of that happening are literally astronomical. I would have to have been told that somehow by someone that to predict something like that. So when you read Isaiah 53, I want you to pay attention to all of the details that are given within Isaiah 53. I think it'll open your eyes.
And
Yes.
it's on a minimum of 150 years.
If I give every single advantage to the non-believer, it's at least 150 BC to 800 plus BC. But we'll forget all that, just 150. Yeah. So take a look at that. Yes.
You know, Isaiah in general, when you read it, you think you're reading the culture of today. There are so many things that he's talking about that just flows right into our culture today. And he's talking to the children of Israel, God's people, kind of wagging his finger at them.
Yeah. It's funny how human emotions haven't changed in years.
Yeah.
This is what makes the Bible so alive. Like even 4,000 years ago, people were still people, right?
Yeah.
They still had families, they still had emotions, they still had love, they still had hate. Love hasn't evolved over the last 200 years or something. It's always been here, right? So it's just people being people in a different time, and so it's cool. And this is, a side note, this is why I love Pastor Craig, because he brings these Bibles, this Bible history. I hate calling them Bible stories, because they're not stories, it's history, right? I love how he brings Bible history to life. And he's talking about these people in the Bible, and what they went through, and the women, and what they were going through at the time of persecution, and the Israelites and stuff. And he brings it to light, because it could be happening now in a foreign country. It could all be happening right now in a foreign country, and it's cool to have him bring that to life like that. But you're right, it's really interesting. So Isaiah 53, that's your homework. All right, let's push on. So, Pre-Cambrian and Cambrian rocks, right? These are the lowest. So, I'm going to show you this. Pre-Cambrian fauna. F-A-U-N-A. This is what they call it. Pre-Cambrian fauna. This is what you will find in the Pre-Cambrian rocks. Okay? So Pre-Cambrian rocks will show you these types of organisms. This is what we find in the rock record, in the fossil record, are these types of organisms. You see stuff like these leafy things, right? And jellyfish. And there's some of these like worms. They're kind of like a worm. So now each of these is what's called a, remember how we talked about at the bottom is species, then above that is what? is genus. So species, then genus, then family, right? So species, genus, family. If you kept going up the chart, you'd eventually reach something called phyla, P-H-Y-L-A, phyla. Phyla are body plans. Like a human body plan, right, is what obviously we have. This is our phyla, but a spider is different, and a caterpillar is different, and a fish is different, and a plant is different, right? They're all different phyla of organisms, because the body plan is different. So these are all different phyla. You have kind of like a worm, kind of like a jellyfish, and then kind of like a leaf. And these are the 3 types of phyla that you will find in the Pre-Cambrian rocks. They think they found maybe 3 other kinds, so maybe there's 6 or so in the Pre-Cambrian rocks, but really 3 of them are definitely not disputed. Okay, and you can find these on eBay. Actually, if you want to look up Pre-Cambrian rocks, there's like a bajillion, and I do mean a bajillion, look like a capital J. There's like a bajillion of these Pre-Cambrian rocks and fossils that you can find and buy and whatever, just own, but they're not much because they look like this, which is, who cares? So, so these are the 3 types of things that you find in the Pre-Cambrian rocks, okay? Now we move one step up to the Cambrian rocks, and is anybody familiar with something from Cambrian in science terms? There was something called the Cambrian explosion, right? Something called the Cambrian explosion. So now in the Cambrian, we've only moved up one of the rock layers. What you find is 3 phyla in the Pre-Cambrian rocks, but in the Cambrian rocks, there are 20 different phyla that just appear in the Cambrian rock layers. And you'll find organisms like this. This is called the trilobite. And I was angry because I have these at home and I forgot to bring them. So if I think about it, I'll bring them next week. But I've got fossil trilobites that I keep at home, okay? And so we went from, keep in mind, we went from these things and just up a step to these things. They have a hard body shell, digestive system, a mouth, an anus, legs, brain, stomach. They don't just have eyes, they have complex eyes. Not simple eyes, complex eyes, like a fly's eyes, right? So a fly's eyes already appeared in these organisms back in the Cambrian rocks. Let me run this past you one more time really quick, okay? So here is our rock layers. Pre-Cambrian, Cambrian. We find these transitionals, should find transitionals throughout the fossil record, right? However, here are Pre-Cambrian phyla, and here's an example of a Cambrian phyla. There's nothing in between. There are no transitional fossils at all in the Cambrian leading up to these trilobites, nor any of the other 20 that I mentioned. This is just one example of the other 19 that exist, and they literally just appear as if out of nowhere. They call it the Cambrian explosion, right? So we have a situation. Now, is this what evolution would predict from here to here with nothing in between?
No, absolutely not.
Correct. That is not a prediction of evolution, right? But what would this be a prediction of?
Creation.
It's a perfect prediction. This is exactly what the Bible reveals to us in Genesis.
Yep.
He created all of the organisms in the oceans, right? How did he do it?
Spoken.
He just spoke it into existence. Stop and think about that. That's how great, that's how powerful our God is. God said live, and could you imagine what that must have looked like? Like, how would you not want to be underwater going, okay, here it comes, right? Right? And all of a sudden you have trilobites and megalodons, and you're running for your life, right? You know? But that's literally what we find. This is exactly what we would predict to find in the fossil record if creation was true. And it's precisely what we would not expect if evolution were true. The Cambrian explosion and these trilobites, there's a reason I own those trilobite fossils. They are one of the most fantastic examples of God's handiwork you can find. And so the question is, from an evolutionary perspective, how does this happen? And they're like, well, and for a while it was, we just haven't found enough fossils to know for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The problem is, you can buy these on eBay all day long. Like, there's literally tens of thousands of these things to purchase. They dig these up all the time.
You buy them at Walmart.
That's true. There's a place in Custer. There's a rock shop in Custer. Sells trilobites. Hill City. Trilobites. You can find them everywhere. Go to any good rock shop, trilobites. There's a huge one, by the way, at South Dakota School of Mines. If you ever go to the school, oh man, there's like a monster one. They're really cool, right? But they appear as if out of nowhere in the rock layer in the Cambrian explosion, as it were. So there's two pushbacks you'll get from the evolutionists. We haven't found enough fossils. Ha! That's my very scientific word for it. Ha!
That was like the combative there, Brian.
I know, right? We have tens of thousands of these things. We have 100,000 of these things worldwide, right? We found all the fossils we're going to find, and it shows that there was some sort of really poof, like there really was an explosion. The other thing they'll say is that if you go back to this, they'll say that this Cambrian is like 70 million years from the bottom to the top, right? And they'll say, well, there were 70 million years, though, for it to evolve. The truth is, that doesn't make any sense, because even if you found a trilobite at the very, very top of the Cambrian, if there's no transitions below it, does it make it any less of a poof? Right, yeah. So even if you, let's say the first time you see a trilobite is at the top of the Silurian. Let's say way up here, let's say a trilobite was here. If you can't find a single transition leading up to it, is it any less of a poof? No. It's the same, right? So that's their argument. They're like, yeah, well, Cambrian 70 million years. Doesn't matter. I don't care where you find the trilobite. You actually find the trilobites in the first, quote-unquote, 20 million years down here. So it doesn't matter anyway. But from the very point, we find things like trilobites that just appear as if out of nowhere. And there's so many changes that would have to take effect to turn a leaf or a worm or a jellyfish into something like this with all these different things, right? Yes, Craig?
So, the Pre-Cambrian rocks contain the leeches and the worms and jellyfish, a lower form of life. How many years then between that and when these other forms of life show up in the Cambrian rock? Cambrian. So where were these creatures? So are you saying there was a second creation?
No. I'm saying that.
Where were these during the Pre-Cambrian?
So this is a very good example. Now, this is going to take us to a little bit of the flood. So in the mind of an atheist, this is how he thinks the flood happened. Take all the organisms, throw them into a big pot, swirl them all around like this, and then bury it with dirt. And we should find humans in the Pre-Cambrian. That's how they think, right? That's not how the flood worked, right? There was a global flood, but that's not how the flood worked. It didn't throw it into a pot, swirl it up, throw a bunch of dirt on it, so we should find stuff mixed around. No, that's not exactly how we would say. Think about this logically. So if there was a flood, okay, there was a global flood, the fountains of the deep opened up, right? Okay, so that would mean that there are fountains of the deep would be underneath the ocean floor, right? And they would explode.
I've never heard of that.
Oh, dude, yeah.
So it rained.
No. Fountains of the deep. It did rain. It did rain too.
It did both.
It did.
Okay.
Yep, it did rain too. But the fountains of the deep opened up, right? And if the fountains of the deep opened up, and a bunch of these underwater volcanoes started erupting and such, and it threw a bunch of silt and dirt and mud, what would it cover first?
Things that shouldn't get away, like the plants.
Things like the plants, yeah. Right? Because they existed on the ocean floor. Did you notice how this picture showed it to us perfectly? These are all on the ocean floor. So what would be buried first? All of this stuff would be buried first, right? It's right close to the ocean floor. And then the trilobites, as you see in the next picture, not only crawled on the ocean floor, but a lot of them could swim, right? So if they were swimming just a little higher than these things were, and as the silt started to build up, what would we expect to find right above these things?
Trilobites.
The trilobites. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yes. So all of these things could have been created all at the same time, on the same day, by God, as we see revealed to us in Genesis. But during the flood, if there was a global flood, it would have been buried in sequential order. So now let's take you back to this.
So there had to be a flood in order to get that reversal.
That's it,
Yeah.
right? So now you have these organisms that lived on the ocean floor that got buried first, followed by your next step, which would be your trilobites and all these other phyla that could swim because they weren't on the ocean floor. And then you go up to things like squid and octopus, which of course would be in little higher waters, right? Because that's where they usually live. But they would also be mixed in with some of these Cambrian, because some of them lived towards the little lower in the water, and some of them were a little higher in the water. And then eventually you get into your jawed fishes, which typically live a little higher in the water and such. And so as you start to lay down these layers and layers of silt, which wouldn't have all happened at once, it would have been one load, and then another load, and then another load. And as you're laying down these layers of things, you would eventually bury these things in sequential order. So this fossil record, as we see it, is not a problem for creationists. It's exactly what we would expect to find. And at the top of it are birds and humans and stuff like that, and what? Organisms that were able to get to higher ground better than the other organisms below them. So you find things like fish and amphibians all kind of buried together. Why? Because the amphibians kind of lived right on the ocean's beaches, and the fish lived towards the surface, so those type of organisms would all be buried at the same time because they all lived in kind of the same elevation, if you were. Then you have, of course, your other dinosaurs. Remember tetrapods? I said tetrapods were buried with those fish, right? Well, if the tetrapods that they found, remember I told you that big thing? It was found walking on a beach. They said it was right by the ocean because they found salt deposits and such. So it lived by the ocean. They thought they were freshwater, but they weren't. So if they're walking on the beach, right, they would be buried with fish, which makes sense from what we find in the record, which is fish along with tetrapod tracks, right? They all lived about the same thing. Then you have your other mammals and such that probably lived further inland and less towards the ocean, and it took a while for all the silt and stuff to build up. And then, of course, those that could climb to higher elevations, of course, would be buried towards the top levels. Then, of course, you get into dogs and cats and whatever, not really dogs and cats, but other such four-legged animals. And you get humans who could climb as high as they could and just finally couldn't get away from it. So the fossil record makes perfect sense from a creationist perspective, too. So if you're from a global flood perspective, this fossil record makes sense. This totally makes sense in the way that the layers would have been laid down. So no, not a second creation event. Same creation event, just buried in a different way according to a global flood type of an idea. So makes sense?
Without the explanation of a flood, though, you couldn't explain it.
I don't think you could. There's some other things you couldn't explain as well. Like every mountain range in the world has clams.
Yeah.
Do you guys know that?
Yeah.
Even Mount Everest has clams on the top, buried. At the top of Mount Everest, there are clams buried on the top of Mount Everest. And here's the curious thing about that. When clams die, what do? They open, right? But if you bury clams, they can actually dig their way up. They turn and they wiggle and they wiggle and they wiggle, and they can actually dig their way up out of sand. And they can dig, I think it's 3 to 6 feet, and still get their way out of this silt, right? So these clams are not dead. They're not found like this. They're found closed.